Greetings, students. Mr. Little here. Today we're going to have a look at Chapter 30, Part 2, Industrialism and Exports in the Age of Independence in the Americas. So the Industrial Revolution as it affects the Americas. By the end of this presentation, you'll be able to answer the two following questions. One, how did the Industrial Revolution affect the economic and political developments of the new states in the Americas? And two, how did the legacy of colonialism demonstrate economic continuities in the new states in the Americas? So in this presentation, what you want to look for as it relates to the AP World Course outline is examples of industrialization and global trade and economic imperialism in the Americas. With that said, let's go ahead and start by talking about the United States. So one thing to keep in mind is that the United States, back when they were the 13 colonies, actually had small manufacturing centers, mostly in the northern colonies, which served as creating manufactured goods for the British market. This meant the United States was already well connected with British investors, including the Baring brothers, who are going to invest in a number of other economic ventures in the Americas. It's also worth noting that the early United States had several notable inventors, such as Eli Whitney, who pioneered interchangeable parts and the cotton gin. Now, the cotton gin is a really interesting item to discuss because the cotton gin made the practice of slavery more profitable by increasing the output that an individual slave could harvest out of cotton. When we discuss the connections between the Industrial Revolution and slavery, it's worth noting that these things are not separate. They actually tend to build on one another. In terms of industrial transportation, the United States had a number of large canal systems that allowed it to expand its production, distribution, and resource extraction. But probably the most famous of these canals was the Erie Canal, which connected the port of New York, which was one of the busiest port in all of the new nation, to the Great Lakes, which then allowed it to be transported into Canada or later on over to Chicago. In terms of railroads, the United States got a bit of a later start, but expanded much further and much faster than most other European countries. So for example, within 40 years, the United States had gone from 31,000 miles of track to 200,000 miles of track. And just like Canada that I mentioned last time, the United States built a Transcontinental Railroad, which was sponsored by the government, which basically linked the west coast of the United States, what is now California, to the Midwest, what we would now call Nebraska. This use of transcontinental railroads, as I mentioned back in Chapter 29, shifted how we understood time. And one of the interesting things was that during this time period, the United States actually hosted the International Meridian Conference, which established the time zones that we use to this day. The spread of railroads to the United States, as well as in Europe and parts of European colonies, helped establish this sense of recognition that time needed to be regulated if we were to have a global economy. Part of the reason the United States was able to do so well was because it had what was referred to as an internal market system. So the United States had a large railroad network, and this railroad network supported the coal and the steel industry. That coal and steel industry in turn supported the railroad industry in a positive feedback loop that expanded the railroads much faster and without the need to necessarily rely on foreign investment, at least after the initial stages of railroad production, as well as the protection of the internal markets from competition, that is, tariffs. So the United States kept tariffs and prevented the flooding of British goods that some Latin American countries would see. The United States was physically large enough to produce almost all the raw materials it needed. For example, in the South, the system of slavery provided a supply of raw materials, for example, cotton, that would then be shipped north and used to produce finished goods in factories. And that's not to say the United States didn't undergo an industrial revolution of sorts. Even before independence, founding fathers such as Alexander Hamilton was talking about something called an American school of production. He theorized that Americans should be building factories instead of necessarily expanding westward as farmers. You also had a guy named Samuel Slater, who created the first water-powered mill in the United States in 1789. And as I mentioned before when talking about the Industrial Revolution, oftentimes women served as the early workforce. The Lowell mill girls in what is now Massachusetts. So much industrial growth was there that by 1900, the United States was the #1 producer of iron and steel in the entire world, producing 25 million tons a year. Just to put that in perspective, in 2020, 120 years later, China is the #1 producer of steel with 1 billion tons produced every year. This industrialization was accompanied by the growth of cities that we talked about in Chapter 29, places like Chicago, which focused on industries such as meatpacking, or Pittsburgh, which focused on steel production, saw massive jumps in their populations. And of course, this came with a lot of the same problems: lack of services, crowded tenement buildings, and in the United States in particular, you saw the growth of ethnic enclaves. And just like in Europe, you saw the same situation. You saw labor organization as well as labor unrest. For example, the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, which brought almost the entire U.S. rail network to a halt for a short time in demand of better wages and conditions. Socialism and anarchism also played a part. The Socialist Party of the USA was founded in 1876, and the assassination of President McKinley in 1901 was done by an anarchist. So the United States was in many ways ways mirroring the Industrial Revolution in Europe, with a lot of the same causes and a lot of the same effects. Now, Latin America takes a slightly different turn. In the last presentation, we talked a little bit about how Latin America's limited experience with trade as a result of Spanish imperial policy meant it did not have any opportunity to build any kind of industrial base. And as a result of that, Latin America remained primarily export-oriented. Many places in South and Central America, the hacienda, that's the large plantation, was a major part of the economy. And it had all the labor it needed via population growth, as well as the abolition of slavery, which was done in the 1850s throughout most of Latin America and in Brazil in 1888. Despite this, many slaves would continue to work for their owners and stay in their economic situation, similar, although not identical, to the situation in the United States. Although there was debate between liberals and conservatives over what to do with the land, liberals tended to argue about breaking up the haciendas and distributing them to individuals, and conservatives tended to argue that the haciendas were very important and ought not to be broken up. The La Reforma movement in Mexico was an effort by liberal politicians to break up most of Mexico's large haciendas. This was pushed back by the conservatives, who actually invited France to invade and occupy Mexico. So even though there was debate over what to do with the land, haciendas and large concentrated plantations remained the norm in Latin America. And this situation was perfectly fine for Europeans and Americans, who were more than happy to pay for the raw materials that came out of these countries, such as copper and guano from Chile, which were used to build telephone lines and fertilize fields, coffee and sugar from Venezuela and Cuba, beef from Argentina, and rubber from Brazil. All of these resources either fed industrial workers or fed literal industrial economies. And so throughout the 19th century, Latin America remained an export-oriented region. Now, this has led to some questions about why was there no industrial revolution in Latin America? Well, Brazil and Mexico did actually see some small-scale efforts at industrialization. But as I said before, the Spanish colonial policy focused on export. All of the infrastructure was focused on export. Combine this with, in some places, 3-decade-long struggle for independence and the virtual elimination of an investor class, with the Peninsulares going back to Spain after these wars of independence. You have countries that are economically devastated with no one to invest and provide additional money, at least nobody from within the country themselves. Additionally, I talked about caudillos as these strongmen who ruled a lot of Latin American countries or parts of them. And usually the caudillos gained their economic influence and power from these large haciendas. And therefore, they weren't exactly keen to push for any sort of economic reform that might threaten their power, such as industrialization. And for several countries, most notably Argentina, upon their independence, they opened up trade with Great Britain, who was already going through its own industrial revolution, and were promptly buried by a wave of British industrially produced goods, which destroyed local production of goods in Argentina itself. So a combination of Spanish colonial policy and the situation after the wars of independence made it very difficult for Latin American countries to industrialize, things that the United States did not have to deal with because of its geography and its own unique colonial history. So when I said that no one in these Latin American countries had the money to invest because the Peninsular class had left and took most of their wealth with them, oftentimes governments and potential entrepreneurs had to look to European and American firms to finance infrastructure development. So for example, the Port of Buenos Aires was created by the British firm, the Baring Brothers. And this was because Great Britain had a prime interest in securing cereal and meat exports from Argentina. British companies, as well as French companies and American companies and German companies, also sought to invest in other potential industrial projects, such as railroads in Peru or mining interests in Bolivia. There was actually a group of British investors who wanted to start Potosi up again, the legendary Silver Mountain from Unit 4. In the end, they found it was too expensive. The wars of independence had done too much damage in there. After about 200 years of mining, there wasn't a lot of easy to access silver. And the thing about these industrial projects is that they usually did not serve the people per se. They more tended to link resources, such as a plantation, to either cities or to ports where they might be shipped out. And this is a trend we're going to see in other parts of the world too. The United States in particular practiced something called dollar diplomacy in the early 1900s. The United States government would give foreign aid, give money to Latin American countries in return for securing American business interests in these countries. And perhaps the ultimate example of the foreign investment in Latin America would be the Panama Canal, which was completed in 1914, which linked the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. This was financed first by a French company and then later by the United States. There's sort of the question of how much it benefited the people of Latin America, because until the late 20th century, it was controlled by the United States. Only a fraction of the funds, the tolls paid through the canal, went to the state of Panama. And all of this emphasis on on exporting goods as well as accepting financial aid from European powers wove Latin America more completely into the new global economy. That core periphery model, Latin America would be considered part of the periphery because it exports either cash crops or raw materials to Europe that might be used as industrial goods, and then they use the money from that export to buy industrial goods from Europe. And you might remember I talked about the South American naval arms race. That is a great example of that. Now, of course, not all Latin American leaders were so good with money, or there may have been extenuating circumstances. But one of the things that begins to happen, first, most notably with Mexico and Argentina, but then more and more Latin American countries, is that when they cannot pay back their debts or they go too much into debt, America and Europe tend to militarily intervene and are more than happy to overthrow governments or occupy cities or ports to extract the wealth or the payment they feel they deserve. Being interwoven into the new global economy does not always come peacefully or without risk. One nation that made a large effort at industrialization was Mexico under the rulership of Porfirio Diaz, who rose to prominence after defeating and expelling the French from Mexico. And he invited much American and European foreign investment. He built tons of rail lines, he financed steel mills, and financed oil wells. And while all of this arguably did boost Mexico to among semi-industrialized status, most of the wealth and the profit was concentrated in the hands of a number of powerful families, and the average standard of living actually went down during this time. Labor organizations, like was seen in the United States, was illegal, and land to build railroads and steel mills was often appropriated from rural or Indian communities. And so this made Porfirio Diaz very unpopular and would lead to the Mexican Revolution later in the course. So Canada continued to be a British colony, technically still is, even though it has its own local government. The Queen is still the Queen of Canada. They remained primarily agricultural, although there was a movement known as the National Policy, which was designed to industrialize Canada, and this meant preventing the U.S. industry from burying Canada with industrial goods, encourage settlements of the western provinces, and build a Canadian Pacific Railroad. In many ways, sort of mirroring what was going on in the United States. In particular, one of the effects of all of this attempt to settle the West and build railroads was a conflict with the French-speaking mestizos, half native, half descendants of French, known as métis, who lived out in the Midwest provinces of what's now Saskatchewan. And there was one particularly important métis leader named Louis Riel, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, I apologize if I'm not, who actually sought to build an independent state that would unite English and French speakers as well as Native Americans in a new democratic government that would push back against what he saw as British tyranny. This most famously led to the Northwest Rebellion, which established the independent government of Saskatchewan. But the problem was his movement was unable to get your English-speaking settlers to the cause, and several military clashes with the government resulted in his capture and execution. And this is, of course, a reminder that political expansion is not without resistance almost always. A little bit of U.S.-Canadian history up until today is essentially, despite the tariffs put up by the National Policy, in general, the U.S. and Canadian economies were integrated by the 1960s. Effectively, the entire automotive industry in the US and Canada was integrated. And with the introduction of NAFTA and the later USMCA, the United States and Canada in particular have heavily integrated economies. And so while Canada has joined the ranks of industrial powers, arguably, it's faced many of the same benefits and challenges that the United States has faced in terms of its. In general, when we talk about the overview, the themes in economic development, it's important to remember that colonial pasts in part shaped economic futures. If you have a history of manufacturing as a colony, you'll have a base for export. And if you don't have a history of manufacturing, you're going to be reliant on whatever you exported during your colonial times to try to get some money to pay for industrialization, or you're going to have to rely on foreign backers who may not give you the most generous terms and may intervene militarily in your country if they don't like you. This is also going to be seen in post-colonial African states in the 1960s and 70s. It also depends on the power of the central government. The United States, after the War of 1812, was arguably a strong, powerful government that was able to resist foreign invasions. Not every Latin American country was so united. If you are a president of a Latin American country who takes out a loan, your successor might have to pay that loan back, even if there was a revolution or a major change in government. And if you cannot pay that loan back, you could be at the mercy of the country or bankers who gave you that loan. This is in part why the French intervened in Mexico, was that the new government of Mexico repudiated the debts of the old government and resulted in French intervention. A combination of the colonial past and the strength of existing governments shaped economic development during this time period. So you should be able to answer those first two questions from the beginning of the presentation. I want to thank you so much for joining me. My name is Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time. Hey there. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this video was able to help you. If you appreciate this kind of work, please like and subscribe. And of course, I welcome any kind of feedback or suggestions, so feel free to leave a comment down below. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.